October 1986, a rain-slicked night in Charlotte, North Carolina. A Porsche 911 turbo hydroplanes on a sharp curve, losing control in the blink of an eye. In that single second, time stopped not just for the man behind the wheel, but for an entire industry. That man was Terry Wayne Allen, known to millions as Magnum T.A. He had the charisma of a Hollywood leading man, the intensity of an elite athlete, and the full weight of an empire, the NWA, behind him. In a world desperately searching for an answer to the Hulk Hogan phenomenon in the North, Magnum wasn't just a prospect, he was the solution. Welcome to the WrestleVerse. Today, we dive into the greatest what if in professional wrestling history. The secret booking plans of Dusty Rhodes, the Starrcade showdown against Ric Flair that was destined to change everything, and how a single car accident handed the keys to the kingdom to Vince McMahon. This is the story of the lost era and the legendary rise that destiny decided to cancel. Part 1. The Prototype of God. In 1986, the wrestling world was a battlefield divided by lines of blood and money. In the North, Vince McMahon was building a neon-colored circus led by Hulk Hogan. But in the South, Jim Crockett Promotions was fighting for the soul of the industry. They didn't need a superhero. They needed a king. They found him in a 6'4", 245-pound powerhouse from Virginia named Terry Allen. But to the world, he was simply Magnum T.A. What made Magnum different? He was the perfect bridge. He had the leading man looks that could attract sponsors and mainstream media, but he possessed an undeniable toughness that respected the traditions of the NWA. According to backstage accounts from Dusty Rhodes, the plan was never just to make him a star. The plan was to make him unbeatable. By the time he defeated Tully Blanchard in the legendary steel cage I Quit match at Starrcade 85, the trajectory was set. Magnum wasn't just climbing the ladder, he was the ladder. Jim Crockett Jr. saw him as the only man capable of stopping the Hulkamania steamroller. He was the counterculture icon for the wrestling purists. The summer of 1986 was the summer of Magnum. Behind closed doors, the booking committee had a singular vision for Starrcade 86, Magnum T.A. versus Ric Flair. This wasn't just a match, it was meant to be the passing of the torch. Flair, the jet-flying, limousine-riding champion, was prepared to drop the big gold belt to the young lion. Crockett was betting the entire company's bank account on this transition. They were preparing to take the NWA national, moving the headquarters to Dallas, and preparing a television blitz that would rival the WWF's WrestleMania machine. Everything, the merchandise, the TV deals, the future of the territories, rested on Magnum's shoulders. But as the leaves began to turn in October, the wind shifted. No one knew that the greatest threat to the NWA wasn't Vince McMahon. It was a rainy night in Charlotte. Part 2. The night the world stood still. October 14th, 1986. A Tuesday night that began like any other in the Queen City of Charlotte. But for the NWA, it was the night the clock stopped. Magnum T.A. was driving his high-performance Porsche 911 Turbo, a car that symbolized his rapid ascent to the top of the world. He was only a few miles from his home when the clouds opened up and the Charlotte roads turned into a mirror of black ice and water. According to the official accident reports found in our research, Magnum wasn't racing. He wasn't reckless. He was simply a victim of physics. The car hydroplaned, spinning out of control and wrapping itself around a telephone pole with such violence that the engine was nearly pushed into the cockpit. For hours, one of the most recognizable athletes in the country lay trapped in the wreckage, unnoticed in the dark as the rain continued to pour. When the news finally broke, it didn't just hit the headlines. It shattered the locker room. There are testimonies from men like Jim Cornette and Ric Flair who described the atmosphere in the hospital as the wake of a man who was still breathing. The NWA wasn't just losing its top draw, these men were losing a brother. But in the cold, clinical halls of the intensive care unit, the doctors were delivering a verdict that was even harder to swallow than death. The man who was built to be a god might never walk again. The impact had exploded his C4 and C5 vertebrae. In an era where wrestlers were seen as indestructible titans, the image of Magnum T.A. paralyzed in a hospital bed was a glitch in the matrix. Backstage, the booking committee was in a state of paralysis themselves. Starrcade 86 was only weeks away. The posters were printed, the tickets were sold, the big gold belt was ready for its new owner. But as Dusty Rhodes sat by Magnum's bedside, the reality set in. There was no plan B. There was no one else who could fill those boots. The NWA's national expansion hadn't just hit a speed bump, it had hit a wall at 80 miles per hour. Part 3. The panic in the booking room. While Magnum T.A. fought for his life in a hospital bed, a different kind of battle was being waged inside the offices of Jim Crockett Promotions. The business of professional wrestling is cold, and it waits for no one. Starrcade 86, the night of the Skywalkers, was less than 2 months away. Thousands of tickets had been sold on the promise of one man, the Crown Prince, who was now paralyzed from the chest down. Dusty Rhodes, the head booker and Magnum's mentor, was a man possessed by grief, but he was also a man with a multi-million-dollar problem. The NWA didn't just lose a wrestler, they lost their investment. The entire 1987 calendar was built around Magnum T.A., taking the world title from Ric Flair and leading a global expansion. Without him, the ship was rudderless. The locker room was in shock, and for the first time, the shadow of Vince McMahon's WWF felt like it was finally closing in on the mid-Atlantic territory. In an act of pure desperation, Dusty Rhodes looked toward the most unlikely candidate to fill the void, the Russian nightmare, Nikita Koloff. At the time, Koloff was the most hated villain in the industry, a Soviet powerhouse who stood for everything the American fans loathed. But the crisis required a miracle. In a moment that shocked the wrestling world, the NWA executed a face turn that defied all logic. They turned the Russian enemy into the American hero's best friend. On paper, it was a masterstroke of emotional storytelling. Nikita Koloff, the man who had been Magnum's fiercest rival, was now fighting in his honor. But behind the curtain, the cracks were beginning to show. You can pivot a storyline in a night, but you cannot manufacture a decade of charisma. Nikita was a physical marvel, but he wasn't Magnum. He lacked the leading man crossover appeal that could sell out arenas in New York or Los Angeles. Inside the inner circle, Ric Flair knew it. Jim Crockett Jr. knew it. The magic that was supposed to propel the NWA to the level of the WWF had vanished on that rainy road in Charlotte. Nikita was a bandage on a bullet wound. As Starrcade 86 approached, the atmosphere wasn't one of triumph, but of survival. The NWA was no longer fighting to win the war against McMahon. They were fighting to stay alive. Stories like Magnum's are the reason we started the WrestleVerse. There is so much history hidden in the shadows of the territories that often goes untold. If you believe that the golden era of wrestling deserves to be preserved with this level of detail, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. It helps us keep the history alive. Now, let's get back to the moment the NWA's future was written in ink, before it was washed away by the rain. Part 4. The Starrcade 86 Remix. November 27th, 1986. Thanksgiving night. For 3 years, Starrcade had been the Christmas of professional wrestling, the night where storylines reached their peak and legends were born. But as the fans flooded into the Greensboro Coliseum for Night of the Skywalkers, there was a palpable sense of absence. The posters still featured the bold letters and the bright colors, but the heart of the show was missing. Magnum T.A. wasn't in the ring. He was in a rehabilitation center, watching the industry he was supposed to lead move on without him. The remix of the card was a logistical nightmare. To fill the void, the booking committee pushed the Night of the Skywalkers scaffold match between the Road Warriors and the Midnight Express as the primary attraction. It was a spectacle of high-altitude danger designed to distract the fans from the hole in the main event. But you can only distract an audience for so long. When the time came for the world title match, the atmosphere changed from excitement to a strange, lingering tension. Ric Flair versus Nikita Koloff. It was a clash of champions, but it lacked the Shakespearean weight of the Flair-Magnum rivalry. Because Magnum and Flair represented two sides of the same coin, the established playboy and the rising blue-collar hero. Nikita, despite his incredible effort and his sudden transition to a fan favorite, was a replacement. Historical accounts of that night often highlight the finish, a 20-minute time limit draw. In the wrestling business, a draw at the biggest show of the year is often a sign of a promotion that is afraid to move forward. They couldn't give Nikita the belt, and they couldn't let Flair lose his luster. They were stuck in creative limbo. The draw was a metaphor for the state of the NWA. For the first time, Jim Crockett Promotions looked like a company that was reacting to circumstances rather than creating them. While Vince McMahon was already planning the historic WrestleMania 3 and the iconic Hogan-Andre showdown, the NWA was simply trying to survive the night. The Night of the Skywalkers was a financial success, but it was a spiritual defeat. The momentum that had been building since 1983 had officially stalled. As the lights dimmed in Greensboro, the reality was clear to those behind the scenes. You can replace a body, you can replace a moveset, and you can even replace a name on a marquee. But you cannot replace destiny. The NWA had survived Starrcade '86, but the golden era they had envisioned was effectively over. Now the question wasn't how they would beat McMahon. It was how long they could hold on before the empire crumbled. Part 5. The Domino Effect. In the wake of Starrcade '86, the NWA entered a period of creative desperation. Without Magnum T.A. to anchor the promotion as the definitive hero, the booking became erratic. This era gave birth to what fans would infamously call the dusty finish, a recurring trope where the hero would seemingly win the title, only for the decision to be reversed on a technicality moments later. It was a symptom of a deeper problem. The promotion was terrified of committing to a new leader because, in their hearts, they were still waiting for a man who wasn't coming back. While Vince McMahon was selling out the Pontiac Silverdome for WrestleMania 3, Jim Crockett Promotions was bleeding money. To compete with the WWF's production values, Crockett bought a private jet and spent millions on a national expansion that the company's infrastructure couldn't support. But the biggest cost wasn't the jet. It was the loss of identity. The NWA was built on realism and intensity, two things Magnum T.A. provided in spades. Without him, the product began to feel like a pale imitation of the spectacle happening in the North. Then, in April 1987, at the second annual Crockett Cup, the industry witnessed one of its most emotional moments. For the first time since the accident, Magnum T.A. appeared before the cameras. He wasn't in a wrestling singlet. He was in a suit, supported by a cane, in the arms of his peers. The roar of the crowd wasn't the usual cheer for a superstar. It was a collective cry of what could have been. It was a moment of pure, unscripted humanity in a business built on artifice. But as moving as his return was, it served as a stark reminder of the void. Magnum would never wrestle again. He would try his hand at commentary and management, but the magic was tied to his physical presence in the ring. By 1988, the financial weight of the failed expansion and the creative vacuum became too much to bear. Jim Crockett Jr., facing bankruptcy, was forced to sell the family legacy to media mogul Ted Turner. The NWA, the proud bastion of traditional wrestling, was rebranded as WCW. the golden era didn't end with a pinfall. It ended in a boardroom, a direct casualty of that rainy night in 1986. Part 6. The final analysis and the legend. The history of professional wrestling is often told as a series of inevitable victories for the winners. We talk about Hogan, Austin, and Cena as if their success was preordained. But the story of Magnum T.A. forces us to confront a different reality. Wrestling is a game of inches, played on slick roads and governed by the whims of fate. If Magnum's Porsche stays on the road that night, the NWA likely stays independent. Ric Flair has a rival that keeps the territory relevant for a decade. The national expansion has a face that fans from New York to Japan can believe in. We will never know if he would have truly toppled Hulkamania. But we do know that on October 14th, 1986, the trajectory of an entire art form was rewritten. Magnum T.A. remains the greatest what-if in the history of the squared circle. A hero who didn't lose his crown to a rival, but to a storm. We are the WrestleVerse. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lost era, please consider supporting the channel by liking this video and sharing your favorite Magnum T.A. memories in the comments. Until next time, may the story live on.